Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the surgical ground round this Friday morning. I hope everything will work okay. We've got a problem with our tech support team who are apparently stuck in an accident somewhere. So please do bear with us if there are any slight glitches at any stage, but it looks smooth at the moment. It's a pleasure to introduce today Peter McCulloch, who's a man obviously who will need no introduction to most of the people listening. But for those who don't know him, Peter's a graduate of Aberdeen University. And trained in surgery and did doctoral research in Glasgow before becoming a senior lecturer in Liverpool. His clinical career has centred on surgical oncology, initially in the breast and latterly in gastroesophageal cancer. Peter moved to Oxford in 2004, where he was appointed Professor of Surgical Science and Practice 9 years later. He's an NIHR senior investigator and runs 2 research groups within NDS. The Quality, Reliability, Safety and Teamwork Unit, QRSTU, evaluates methods for improving quality and safety of surgical interventions and is currently running a 24-centre randomised trial, RESPOND, of a human factors intervention to improve rescue efforts for patients with serious post-operative complications. Peter also founded the IDEAL collaboration in 2009 to promote the better use of methodology in the scientific evaluation of surgery and other complex healthcare interventions. This group has developed recommendations for an integrated evaluation pathway for surgical studies throughout the life cycle of an operation, and more recently has applied the same principles to guidance for the evaluation of therapeutic devices and of AI in healthcare. And they published their recent paper on evaluation of surgical robots in Nature Medicine in January this year. Peter has with him 2 equally eminent guest speakers who will introduce during the course of the talk. So during the talk, if I could just remind everyone to switch cameras and microphones off. We'll take questions at the end, and with that, over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, James, and thanks for sort of rushing out of neurosurgery handover to make it in time. So James was saying I'm going to be talking today about the IDEAL collaboration and surgical robots, because I think that we're at a very important time in surgical history with the advent of new robots, and I think IDEAL can help us, as I say, to get it right this time. But I'm going to explain for those of you who haven't heard about IDEAL before, and those of you for whom it's become part of the wallpaper, exactly what it is.
We may have lost sound online.
I think so.
Professor, your microphone is muted.
Hello, can you hear me now? Oh
Yes.
dear, right. I'm going to have to go back one. Sorry about that. So as I was saying to myself, this talk is about IDEAL and surgical robotics, and you'll see why I call it Can We Get It Right This Time? And the first part of it is going to be me explaining what IDEAL is and why we decided that we needed to do a particular study on surgical robots. And then I'm going to hand over to John Hanrahan, one of the people who led this study, and thirdly to Professor Mark Slack, whom many of you will have met. He's the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer for Cambridge Medical Robotics, and he's going to give us an ethical industry perspective on this. So how did I do that again? Oh yes, that's how. So as I was saying, surgery has transformed itself really in the years since 1948. Why 1948? Well, that was the year we did the first randomized trial in medicine, the streptomycin trial. And parallel with the improvements in treatment, improvements in medical science have transformed during that period. It didn't happen very quickly to start with. The real acceleration in randomized controlled trials in medicine was a consequence of the thalidomide disaster in the 60s, where the US passed the Kefauver-Harris Act, which essentially made it obligatory for drugs to have a randomized trial before they could be marketed. So coercion works, but it quickly became an established gold standard for treatment evaluation, a lot of it due to the evidence-based medicine movement, which pushed this very strongly in the 1990s, comparing the success of randomized trials with the failure of the United States expert consensus meetings that the FDA used to host in those days. So there were compelling arguments in favor of doing randomized trials, but, and other surgeons of my generation can testify, right to the end of the 20th century, I would say that most surgical professors thought they weren't really suitable for surgery. And if you looked at the efforts of surgeons to do randomized trials, it was a kind of good news, bad news story during this period. The first successful trials in surgery were really the breast cancer trials led by Fisher in the 70s and 80s, and these led to the abolition of the radical mastectomy. But one of the next big technical advances in surgery was total mesorectal excision in colorectal surgery in the 80s, and that happened without any randomized trials. Radical stomach cancer surgery was an example of where surgeons tried to do randomized trials, but came up with completely misleading results, leading not to scientific advances, but to increased controversy. And a famous trial that came out of Oxford, the ISAC trial on clipping versus coiling for subarachnoid hemorrhage, showed conclusively that interventional radiology was better than surgery in this instance, but the practical results of that were different around the world. Practice changed very rapidly in the UK, quite rapidly in Europe, and hardly at all in the US. So that's the scene up to now, but something I haven't mentioned that happened in the 90s mainly was the onset of minimally invasive surgery, which was a complete revolution for many branches of surgery. And of course, we have another revolution coming on stream now with robotic surgery. And minimally invasive surgery wasn't a pretty story when it came to evaluation. There was a stampede for adoption, which I remember very well. And there was a huge wave of early morbidity caused by surgeons who embarked on operations without proper training. And we had a 8 to 16-fold increase in common bile duct injuries during the early 90s, which subsequently stabilized at only 1.5 to 3 times worse than open surgery, where it has interestingly remained. There was a failure to adopt randomized trials. They were done eventually, but they had very little effect on people's practice. And it was this that led Richard Horton from the Lancet to lampoon us in his famous editorial, Surgical Research or Comic Opera. So does it matter? After all, we have made these great advances. Well, of course it matters. You know, it matters in terms of the collateral damage we do during this process. It matters in terms of continuing to do the wrong thing, which in some cases we have done. It matters ethically and in reputational and legal terms. And of course, it matters in terms of our research funding. The famous figure touted by the Royal College of Surgeons of England a few years ago was that we got 2% of the national research funding budget. And the trials did finally arrive, and here are some of them, and they demonstrated significant benefits in terms of recovery time and complications from the minimally invasive surgery once people were properly trained. But it was, if you like, a back-to-front process. And it led some of us to reflect on why it's so difficult to do randomized trials in surgery at the right time. We identified 5 barriers to RCTs in surgery. The need for a definition of the operation. You don't need that for a drug. The formula is quite clear. The need for iterative modification when you start a new procedure. All people who start a new procedure, at least all the ones I've spoken to, agree that they didn't do the second one the same, and that there is a short period of rapid iterative modification whilst you're perfecting the technique before it's stable. There's also, as we all know, variation in delivery quality in surgery, and we have to have some kind of benchmark for that before we can start properly comparing the new operation with another one. Otherwise, we get into terrible problems caused by learning curve effects. And the last two problems are the same problem, which is us. Surgeons are much more intimately engaged with the things we do and feel more strongly about them. So it's very difficult for surgeons to have equipoise about a new operation that they're invested in. This makes a difference to the way in which we consent patients, and patients pick up very easily, even if we try to hide it, whether we feel genuine equipoise about whether the treatment's better or not. Now, if we compare this with pharma, of course, they have this famous phase 1 to 4 paradigm, which has served them very well, not just in terms of making money, but in terms of bringing dramatic improvements in treatment. And if you notice, they don't do randomized trials immediately either. They have phases 1 and 2, which can be non-randomized. The way the pharma industry went about this was to look at the life cycle of drugs and ask themselves, at what stage do we need to do what studies? So they start with toxicity studies to see how much the human body can tolerate, and then they go on to dose ranging and studies, and then they go on to comparative evaluations. We set up a group in Oxford in the 2007 to 2009 period to look at the surgical life cycle. How do surgical operations develop? And this is where the IDEAL acronym came from. It stands for Idea, Development, Exploration, Assessment, and Long-Term Monitoring, just names to describe the different phases an operation goes through. This little table shows you what we discovered. Stage 1, we labeled the first in human operation, so there's not much to say about that, except that it needs to be faithfully reported, whether it goes well or not, and it needs to be explained, as do the outcomes. In stage 2A, this is the tinkering phase, when operations undergo rapid iterative modification. I was interested to find in a biography of Charnley recently that he went through this phase with the artificial hip, and one of his failed innovations was a metal-on-metal hip, which had just the same problems as the ones that we encountered decades later, but he didn't report it until he wrote his biography. In stage 2B, this is a stage where other surgeons are taking up the technique, and inevitably we have controversy, disagreement about points of technique and indications. We also have concerns about whether everybody's on the same page in terms of quality, and often attempts at surgical randomized trials fail at that point. If we can get consensus, which is key here, then we can go on to stage 3 and do a randomized trial. And stage 4 is simply the same as drugs. It's long-term surveillance, looking for rare effects and late effects. If you look at these 5 stages, each of them has a key question that needs to be answered before you can move on. Stage 1, it's simply what is the new treatment? Stage 2A, it's have we stabilized it yet? In stage 2B, it's about consensus. Can we agree on definition and indications so that we can get on with a randomized trial together? Stage 3 is the randomized trial comparative stage, and stage 4 simply asks, are there any surprises, late or rare effects? So the novelty of IDEAL was to create these 2 new stages in the scientific evaluation of surgery, and at each of these stages, we made recommendations for a different type of prospective cohort study, not a trial, because at these stages, it's too early to do a trial. And this filled a big gap that had previously been empty, which was the reason for some of the Horton criticisms of surgery. I'm only going to talk briefly about stages 2A and 2B because I say they're the innovation in IDEAL. Essentially, our recommendations for stage 2A is that since you're innovating and iterating and changing quite frequently, you should present all your cases in a prospective cohort study sequentially, showing the results as they develop and whether they change after different changes to technique or to indications, and explaining all those changes clearly. This is normally quite a small study, so it shouldn't take long or cost too much. And it's ethically superior to what we've done before, because it allows others to learn from our mistakes. This is an example of a stage 2A study, the first robotic esophagectomy series from Spain. The graph shows 6 arrows, which are the 6 changes the surgeons made during their first 21 cases. And if you look at the graph, you can see that the purple bars go up after arrow number 3. This is when they had developed enough confidence in their technique that they were able to do a block dissection of the mediastinal lymph nodes. And I think this would demonstrate much more clearly that you should take care and not do that until you're ready to do it, which a case series would not have done. In stage 2B, we recommend a prospective collaborative cohort study large enough to give us some idea about variations in results depending on variations in technique and type of patient. So this is largely a study done to collect enough data that we can have a confident idea of the effect estimate and consider whether we can do a randomized trial together. We also recommend qualitative research at this stage to see whether both the patients and the clinicians are happy to go into a randomized trial with a given question. An example of this was a study done in China on using high-intensity focused ultrasound for fibroids, in which David Cranston from the NDS was involved. The Chinese had done a great job of doing ideal stages 1 and 2 without ever having heard of it. And they were doing a 20-center prospective cohort study. They had already decided to do a comparison with surgery, which we couldn't really change, but they had very tight control of learning curves and quality control. And these are some of their results. You can see on the top right hand, the graph showing significant complications, that there was approximately 20 to 30-fold difference between HIFU and the surgical operations in these. And you can also see that length of stay, which is very long by Western standards, was much longer for the surgical operations. When you analyze the groups, they are quite different because the patients decided which treatment they were getting. And therefore, one cannot look at this as you could with a randomized trial and say that this proves definitively that HIFU is better. To my mind, however, it proves definitively that you'd be mad to do a randomized trial between these two alternatives with these as outcome measures. No patient and no sensible surgeon is going to enter patients into that trial. So the 2B study has had an important benefit of telling us what not to do. And in fact, the Chinese decided to do a study looking at recurrence after myomectomy versus HIFU because it isn't actually known whether things can come back after HIFU in this situation. So IDEAL put together does provide an alternative to the pharma integrated evaluation pathway. And we think that's a really important advance. Now to surgical robotics. In terms of evaluation, surgical robotics has had an uncertain start. It was started with military funding on a kind of fantasy proposal about robots that ran out onto the battlefield. And it quickly became effectively captured by one company, which had a commercial monopoly for about 15 years. It was introduced without randomized trials. The first randomized trial was done many years after the first robot operation, with few attempts at unbiased evaluation. So you can see echoes of the problems we had with minimally invasive surgery here, with a different twist in that there's a monopoly provider. It gained traction, particularly in the US, because of competitive private healthcare and marketing direct to patients, but not because of objective scientific evidence. One thing that the papers and case series did show that it's consistently slower and more expensive than alternatives, and evidence of convincing major benefit was hard to find. So now that Da Vinci Intuitive have lost their monopoly, there are over 60 robots going through approval processes and about to hit the market. This is an opportunity to do the evaluation right, isn't it? And with IDEAL, we believe we have a tool which can help us do the clinical evaluation right. So do you think that using IDEAL, we can do a proper evaluation for the surgical robots? Actually, I don't think so. The reason I don't think so is because I think the question is too big. We can do a clinical evaluation And I think it would be a very good thing to use the ideal process to evaluate new robots. But the trouble is that the things that robots do to the surgical process go well beyond the clinical results. Robots are what is called in business schools a disruptive innovation. They're a change that is so major that they change the entire business process. And that means that in order to do a proper evaluation of whether you should or you shouldn't, you have to look at lots of other areas. And on the list here, we have a list of the other areas where we know robots make a big change. They change the way surgeons are trained. They change the way operating theatres behave together. They change the ergonomics of doing an operation and the business model. Suddenly, there's enormous pressure to sweat the assets and have the robot working as long as possible. Patients' perceptions and consent are strongly influenced by the fact that the robot is in the room. This happened with the minimally invasive operation as well, when it was difficult to persuade some patients that it wasn't a laser and it didn't have magical powers. They wanted it. Digital transformation and AI integration fit very neatly with the robot, and the autonomous robot is a real prospect in the clinical lifetimes of many of us. And of course, investing in robots brings opportunity costs in other areas. So we felt that, yes, we would love people to use IDEAL for clinical evaluation of robots, but what was important is that we had a proper holistic evaluation. Clinical benefit is necessary but not sufficient to justify adoption of the robot. We also need to look at all the other other impacts that it's going to have. And looking at how the process has developed over the last few years, I personally have some concerns about commercial capture. What I mean by this is that in a situation where you have powerful commercial players, it's possible for them to put huge pressure on politicians, on industry, and make a lot of propaganda for the public to sell the dream that involves their product. The example I would use for this are the World Trade Fairs, 1935 to 39, where the Ford Motor Company, not a monopoly supplier, but very dominant in those days, spent the equivalent of billions in modern money on a series of exhibitions, giving the Americans the dream of a new car-based life, where roads and not railways ruled, and each individual had their own car. And of course, it worked. Up to the 30s, America was a railroad-based society. Now it's completely car-based, and railroads have almost disappeared. So I'm interested in getting the holistic evaluation right, so that we make sure that decisions to use robots are based on the best evidence of benefit in healthcare. We need a broad expert representative consensus for this, so we set about involving other important players, particularly the Royal College of Surgeons of England and the NHR, in forming an expert colloquium with multiple different groups of experts. And this was going to be, and I believe successfully was, an industry-academia dialogue. We didn't exclude industry, which interestingly led the Lancet to reject us when we came to publication. And we're not trying to hold back progress in robotics. The aim is to be inclusive, and the goal is to ensure that adoption is guided by evidence of clinical and societal benefit. I'm now going to hand over to John Hanrahan, who's a registrar in neurosurgery at Queen Square in London, and one of a small group of trainees who did all the hard work of putting this together. I'm immensely grateful to John and his colleagues and very impressed by their work. John, I think it's over to you now. I'm going to stop sharing.
Good morning. So my name is John Hanrahan. I'm an academic clinical fellow in neurosurgery at Queen Square in London. Thank you very much for inviting me on behalf of our team to share the Ideal Robotics Colloquium. So this was published this year, and it's essentially a framework in an attempt to evaluate or guide evaluation of surgical robotics. And I must say at the outset, I'm a very small cog in what was a huge team that produced this piece of work, led by Professor McCulloch, Mr. Hanny Marcus, and Professor Ramirez. alongside all the authors in the colloquium. So we've had a bit of history, but I'll go a little bit further back than Professor McCulloch. If we go back to CapEx play in the 20s, called Rossum's Universal Robots, that was the first conceptualization of the robots that we see in film and in media. The first actual robot used was in the automated transfer of radioactive materials as part of the Oak Ridge Lab in the United States, and that ultimately became part of the Manhattan Project. And we can see on the right, this is Unimate, which formed part of the General Motors production line. And these early stage use cases exemplify some of the advantages that robots can bring, things like telepresence, obviating the need for humans to be present at a task, reliable repetitive task completion, and then also even extension of human function. And we can all see the potential applications for systems like these in surgery. And so the first surgical robot was published in the late 80s by Corr and colleagues. It was a stereotactic biopsy in neurosurgery. And this was followed then by the Da Vinci, approved by the FDA in the year 2000. And we're here 24 years later as the patent expire and the monopolies weaken. This is purely looking at the NHS supply chain contract from 2022. We've got at least 9 systems functioning in the NHS. And the Royal College reported last year in their Good Practice Guide for Robot-Assisted Surgery that around 12 million operations have been performed since the 90s using robots, and about 1.2 million were performed in 2022. So we can see that the frequency is picking up. In the UK, over 100 hospitals use robots, and we're seeing the market share grow from, it kind of depends on whose numbers you use, but from about 3 to 4 billion to about 5 to 10 in the next few years. So it is exciting. It's exciting for us as clinicians and surgeons. It's exciting for patients. But as Professor McCulloch has just outlined, we know that without adequate evaluation, innovation can risk harm to patients. And we've touched on thalidomide. So it was McBride's letter to the editor of The Lancet that was one of the first alerts associating the malformations in children with thalidomide. And we've mentioned metal hips already. And closer to home in terms of this talk, thinking about minimally invasive surgery, these are sort of the predecessors of surgical robots when thinking about evaluation. There were some issues faced in the early stage of this revolution in surgery. Picked out a random couple of points, but the discovery of the impact of learning curves and outcomes, things like higher costs, which were sort of unexpected, and some of the new legal and ethical issues associated with innovative devices. And if you pick costs and think about why were costs underestimated, there's some reasons here on the slide which I think aren't important to delve into. I think conceptually it shows that there's a need for pause and careful thought about how you evaluate and monitor a device. And also, how can we learn from these lessons in the past to apply to innovations of the future? And talking about robots, we've already seen examples of some systems being introduced for specific indications and subsequently being retracted or criticised after further evaluation. So Melamed in 2018 published a study indicating or comparing open surgery to minimally invasive surgery and robotic surgeries in the minimally invasive surgery arm in this study. And in a relatively fitter cohort of women with lower grades of cervical cancer, the oncological outcomes were worse. And this prompted the FDA to issue a warning with respect to this indication for robot-assisted surgery. That's just one example. But there is good evidence to show that the stepwise evaluation of these systems is presently lacking. And things like market influences and even enthusiasm bias can threaten their safe implementation into health systems. We know that the field is accelerating, and therefore the time is probably now to try and avoid mistakes of the past and improve how we evaluate these systems. And Professor McCulloch has outlined the key challenges. And I think in a nutshell, these systems are, for surgical systems, the most complex technologies entering thus far. And they bring with them bespoke challenges, things like dynamic artificial intelligence or things like telepresence. Features themselves exceed our existing evaluation paradigms, including the ideal framework. And we've touched on some of the alterations with human factors and the clinical workflows that these systems bring. Uniquely, the high cost of some of the robotic systems significantly impact the allocation of health resources at the organizational level, but also the health system level. And conceptually, we think about most surgical interventions, robots included, as complex interventions, meaning their success depends on several factors, both inside and outside the operating theatre. So what we're trying to say, essentially, surgical robots require dedicated consideration to determine how best to approach their evaluation. And this was the motivation for the Ideal Robotics Colloquium. So just a brief overview of the methodology. So this was an international multi-stage consensus study, and we worked in conjunction with the NIHR and the Royal College of Surgeons, and we formulated 7 distinct panels related to the key domains for evaluating a robot. And these panels included a range of experts: surgeons, engineers, economists, philosophers, device regulators. There's a wide range of skills comprising these panels. Panel leaders were selected from the Ideal Council, and then about 8 to 12 subject matter experts formed the individual panels. And then, independent to this process, we conducted some independent midline searches to identify related publications for each of the domains, to identify additional potential members, and each panel had at least one independent member to try and reduce association bias. And then a formal consensus process was followed, and there was a standardized structure to identify the key domain challenges that robots face, according to the 7 panels. And then there was a unified approach to generate recommendations aligning to the 3 principles on the slide. Each panel produced a report which was analysed by a central team, and the central team aligned the challenges and recommendations to the ideal stages, and we grouped them to the early evaluation, comparative assessment, and the long-term monitoring. At each stage, or at each group of stages in the framework, we looked at the 4 key perspectives defined by the Ideal D framework, namely the device perspective. So is the device safe and effective? The clinician perspective, is it usable? What are the learning curves? The system perspective, thinking about costs and the wider impact of these systems, and also the patient perspective. So that's the kind of backdrop and the overview of the methodology. Now I'm going to talk through some highlights of the challenges and recommendations that we found according to the ideal stages, and we'll use the 4 stakeholder perspectives just to orientate ourselves. So just to recap, stage 0 is preclinical studies. Stage 1 is a first-in-human study. And stage 2A are the small-scale case series, trying to achieve some sort of stability in the system before moving to a larger study. So primarily, a device has to be safe, feasible, and acceptable in the earliest stages of development. And the sort of one of the key milestones here is examining the device or evaluating the device in humans. Now, regulators approve such studies, and therefore they tend to dictate the assessment domains that are necessary. And these requirements vary depending on the regulator. So if we look at the FDA and versus the MHRA, their sort of description of what they require is slightly different. But even variance is seen within the same regulatory body. So the process is not completely standardized and completely uniform. And whilst there are relatively clear standards for technical metrics that the ISO define, safety and effectiveness metrics tend to be defined by the applicant, the robotics company, and therefore can be quite heterogeneous. Similarly, artificial intelligence is playing an increasing role in surgical robots, and the safety implication of these features must be captured. Now, these algorithms can be dynamic, and therefore, if they're evolving, they can outdate our existing relatively static evaluation methods. And Professor McCulloch outlined or alluded to autonomous robotic systems, and autonomy itself introduces risks where a system may act in an unsafe way to achieve the defined surgical aim. So these are some of the recommendations. So this is why we advocate a move towards harmonizing and standardizing these data sets to develop standards for reporting and improving comparability. The AI elements themselves should be separately evaluated and subsequently evaluated in simulated forms integrated into the robot before reaching humans. And as early as feasible, clinical outcomes should be studied, ideally in the stage 1 phase, following defined reporting guidelines. And then when we think about autonomy should be determined based upon the level of autonomy and the perceived risk of the autonomous component. So you can employ something like a failures, modes and effect analysis to stratify risk, where more extensive evidence would be needed for higher risk, more autonomous systems. So in these early stage studies, when thinking about the clinician perspective, we have to think, is it usable? So this diagram has come from Dr. Kenneth Catchpole, who's a human factors expert, which I think does a good job in capturing some of the complexities and stakeholders in robotic surgery. And if you look at the diagram, the focal points are the human resources, which are key for the success of the system functioning. Now, primarily, the system must be accepted and usable by these stakeholders to function. And this depends on the impact the system has on users. Think about ergonomics and cognitive burden, but also the clinicians must trust the system in performing the tasks they're required to do. And conflicts can arise when autonomous systems are introduced, or if there are artificial intelligence components, because these can alter the responsibility and liability paradigms. And clinicians will have collaborative relationships with these technologies, and in some cases may feel the need to override or take over if they're concerned that the robot is going to perform an act that they think is unsafe. Which means iterative human factors assessment is fundamental in these early stage evaluations in order to support usability. And some of the bespoke aspects that AI and autonomy bring must be addressed. Things like handover mechanisms and reasons for takeover have to be defined and evaluated. Moving to the patient, is this something that patients would accept? And at all stages, but greatest in these early stage 1 and stage 2A studies, new technologies provide issues for informed consent, and this is in part due to limited experience with the technology and an incomplete picture of the risks. So the Royal College of Surgeons last year outlined their advice on consenting for robotic surgery, and they've outlined 5 features on the slide, which our recommendations are in keeping with. I think we go a little slightly further, just in relating the consenting process to specifically relate to the autonomy level of the system, and also thinking about the potential conflicts of interest of the team advocating potentially innovative technology. So we're going to move from the patient perspective to the system, and we need to think, is there a wider need for the robotic system in question, and is it worth the investment? And in economics, there are 2 ways of applying an evaluation, either through evaluating something to answer or judge it, or in a more exploratory manner, which we call innovative practice. And we've taken this from our economics reports, and it outlines that innovative practice have no means of defining quite key aspects.
Yeah, so just a couple of things that actually, from an immunosuppression perspective, our
You're muted, John.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Sorry about that. I thought I was muting the person who was talking, but it turns out I muted myself. So talking about innovative practice, we don't at the moment have established guidance or means of performing these early stage exploratory economic evaluations. And we think these are quite important because they can be used to identify or steer an innovation towards a viable function. We acknowledge that these tasks are in part speculative and provide projections, but there is good evidence that exploratory economic evaluations are helpful in making the translation process more efficient and effective. Thinking about, for example, a headroom analysis to identify the highest price that an innovation could be viable for. So that's the early stage. We're going to move into the comparative evaluation phase now. So this is your multi-center studies and your comparative trials. So if we look at the MAUD database from the FDA in the United States, quite recently they reported on adverse events in robotic surgery, and there are 2,000 patient injuries, 17,000 events, and they related about 294 fatalities to robot-assisted surgery. Now, we can't ascribe causes because we're looking at their reports, but on the backdrop of variable and often poor reporting in robotics trials, this is an area that is a high priority area for research quality improvement. So Gardfield's review found significant flaws in both trial reporting and funding declarations, and elucidated quite a significant heterogeneity in terms of the research base and areas of potential bias. And limitations in the methodologies of papers are quite clear, and the existing strategies need improvement to assess the whole system change that robots entail. So there are efforts ongoing. So the RoboCOS looks to produce a comprehensive core outcome set for robotic surgery to try and capture the whole system transformation that some of these systems bring. But these efforts are in their infancy. So I think it goes without saying, but selecting appropriate study designs is fundamental but circumstantial. So if a trial is not ethically feasible, or if an appropriate control is not available, independent ethical advice is needed at that point to decide what the appropriate study design would be. So for example, if a robot proposes a completely new effect with no existing comparator. Now, irrespective of study design, prospective high quality data, drawing on core outcome sets with established and valid outcome measures ideally should be undertaken. And timing of when a reassessment should be performed needs to be thought about with changes, thinking about changes in risk or autonomy level, triggering a review for re-evaluation either at the comparative stage or earlier if necessary. So we're in the comparative evaluation phase, and learning curves here are fundamental. They're an important source of variation and bias within trials, and understanding them and their effects is vital for safe and effective translation of your device. So this figure is from the ROLAR trial, and it compares 4 surgeons with different experiences in laparoscopy. And on the x-axis is the number of robotic surgeries performed, and on the y-axis is the odds of converting to an open procedure. And you can see as you perform more robotic surgeries, independent roughly of your laparoscopic experience, the more robotic surgeries you do, the less likely you're going to have to convert to an open surgery. And this was great because in this trial, they identified this learning effect during the ROLAR trial, and then they used a sensitivity analysis to adjust their primary outcome measure according to the learning curve. And so we advocate quite strongly that these learning curves must be investigated and defined, and where possible, adjusted for in your analysis to avoid confounding of these effects at the trial stage. Moving back to the patient acceptability influences enrollments in trials, and this itself is positively and negatively influenced by media, industry, and marketing psychology. And our duty is to inform true informed consent, requiring consideration and minimization of bias where possible. So acceptability should broadly be thought in relation to the patient's perception of the procedure, their understanding, and then their consent to engage. And at this stage, maximal transparency is important where as feasibly possible to foster proper shared decision making. And thinking in the trial setting, employing research nurses or decision support systems can be ways of mitigating enthusiasm bias, or even engaging the surgeons that are consenting patients in training to reduce unconscious bias. So finally, for this stage, the systems perspective. So if we prove that this is a highly effective robot, the clinicians love it and the patients want it, still we should prove or demonstrate that this is needed in the wider health system. If we replaced all open surgeries with robotic surgery, we'd add about $2.5 billion to the cost of surgery, and that's likely a huge underestimate. Some studies show robots add about $1,000 to $4,000 on average compared to minimally invasive alternatives. And when we look at the wider health needs of health systems in some areas of the world, and you can argue some places in the NHS, the fundamentals haven't been achieved yet, such as access to timely care, which often represent higher priorities than these novel technologies. And this isn't to say that robots don't have a role, but their place amongst these competing needs must be defined. So their high cost warrants high quality economic evaluations to accompany trials, and perspectives from and experience from low resource settings should inform modelling to examine the system's role and impact in a wide range of environments. So this is the final phase in both the ideal stage and in this talk, which looks at the long-term monitoring and technological evolution when the system has been evaluated and implemented and we're monitoring it in the real world. And here the system performance is critical for patient safety. And this is where ideally we need international surveillance systems with cooperation from regulators, providers, and all other stakeholders, because this is where the system's true performance will be evaluated and it will interact most with patients. So this is the longest phase in the ideal framework. The systems that we have at the moment predominantly are registries. They're passive, they often underreport errors, and in a lot of circumstances are maintained and owned by the robotic system providers themselves. At this stage, there is less of an incentive to generate high quality data sets, as regulation does not necessarily demand it for progression as it does in the earlier ideal stages. And this means that the existing evidence base is weak and fragmented. And we know both commercial and regulatory processes play a part in limiting the data transparency at this stage. So ideally, we'd have integrated real-world data and registries, provided the quality can be assured. And this would give us the means to monitor the real-world performance of robotic systems. These data sets need to be rapidly generated and scalable to feed back performance in a timely fashion to be usable. AI-enabled systems will need particular attention, with the initial use and indication clearly stated to allow detection of device creep in these systems, and monitoring of device and procedure creep should trigger a review if their use moves away from experimental evidence. Thinking about clinicians, after the comparative evaluation stage, even if a device is proven to be safe and effective, these systems can be unsafe and a risk to patients in untrained hands. Now, training for these systems often is provided by individual companies, and at the moment is non-standardized and doesn't require ongoing certification and credentialing, as opposed to other high-risk industries. And this was an area of focus for the RCS Robotic Assisted Surgery report, which gives examples of the minimum standards for supervised operating and required case volumes per year. So in terms of our recommendations, these training programs do require standardization, establishing the standards and being recognized by the relevant accrediting bodies. And also the process of ensuring quality should continue after credentialing, with revalidation a continued part of monitoring surgeons using these devices. So in the real world, when a system is implemented, it will be procured for a particular patient group and procedure, and naturally new uses will be discussed aiming to replicate these benefits in a wider variety of patients. The evidence informing the initial use of this robot is likely to be insufficient for new and different applications, and this is procedure creep. This won't be obvious necessarily to patients, and similarly, iterative changes may alter the function of the system, again affecting the validity of original evidence or past experience of the team using the system. That's termed device creep. So this means that up-to-date, high-quality data must inform the consent process even after implementation, accessible to patients during the consenting process. And finally, going back to the system perspective, and there's, I think, one of the most fundamental aspects of stage 4 is the growing evidence of the high environmental impact of surgical devices. And this was outlined on the left through the devices and consumables in Robinson's paper, indicating the high burden that surgical operations bring to a carbon footprint. And the entry of robotics itself increases our own carbon footprint. So seen on the right, with robotic carbon emissions far exceeding the comparative approaches. So outside of the traditional metrics that we evaluate a system, sustainability is growing, and I think we can agree increasingly important. Strong arguments are needed in favour of robotic surgery to counterbalance the environmental impacts seen through life cycle assessments, and this issue makes an argument for innovators to adopt sustainable practices in the development, implementation and maintenance of these systems. So this graph demonstrates the increasing frequency of environmental impact assessments, and they're incorporated into the healthcare LCA repository. It's an open, transparent data set, iteratively updated with environmental impact assessments. And we think innovators should measure and minimize environmental harms of whatever system, including robots, fostering collaborative investigation to determine the impact of their settings in the real world. So these are our recommendations for the final phase of the colloquium, and I'll just focus on the sustainability. This aspect of evaluation is something that we're currently studying, and it's in its infancy, but we do think this should form a formal part of evaluation for these new systems that are going to have significant impacts on the environment and therefore risk being unsustainable. So here's a summary of the talk, and I think to conclude, it's clear that surgical robots are on the brink of achieving their disruptive potential. This colloquium has outlined recommendations which we've mapped to the ideal framework for their evaluation. Now, it's not exhaustive nor instructive, and not all recommendations will be appropriate for each system. However, we present this to offer a starting point to try and begin improving how we evaluate surgical robots. I realise I've gone a little bit over time, but thank you so much for listening, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, John. We do want to give our final speaker, Mark, slack some so if you could stop sharing, that'll allow him to share his screen. I'm going to be brief because I have to be. Mark is a phenomenon. He is one of the 4 founders of Cambridge Medical Robotics and has built it up into one of the leading robotic companies in the world. He's also been unusually interested in the ethics of evaluation for his robots, which is why I've invited him to give his perspective on what the colloquium said and what is going to happen when it impacts on real life. Mark, I'm sorry we haven't given you so much time, but over to you.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, no, Peter, I thought that was just the mechanism used to keep industry quiet and to give them 3 minutes at the end of a session. So I'll see what I can do as quickly as possible, because I'm sure people need to go to work. It's nice being at Oxford, if virtually. I ran an anatomy course with Simon Jackson, John Morris, and John Rayner in Oxford for about 16 years. So always happy to come back. I mean, the whole reason I got into the concept of doing the robotics safely was twofold. One, I lived through the debacle in the 90s of introduction of laparoscopic surgery, which is pretty grim. And two, I'm one of the authorities on implantable plastics and warned in the 90s that vaginal mesh was likely to be a disaster, and then watched it evolve. And even being the expert witness in the class actions didn't really soften the blow that must have been felt by a lot of patients. And remember that vaginal mesh was introduced with randomized controlled trials, etc., but they don't always solve the problem. So I know that we know now that minimal access surgery is better than open, and yet about 60% of patients worldwide, even in America, still get open surgery. And therefore, we have to find an alternative to the difficulty experienced with laparoscopic surgery. Am I right? So, I'm going to just pop past the conflicts of interest. I still have honorary positions at both the university and Addenbrooke's. I was previously head of the Department of Gynae, but don't do any clinical work at all. We started the company in 2014 to actually increase the uptake of minimal access surgery with easier training and so on, and now have done more than 20,000 procedures in 160 centers in the world, and are the second largest soft tissue company in the world. And that's what it looks like. And those of you familiar with robotics will see that it has a very small footprint. Tony in that picture is 5'7", so you can see the size of it, and it can be moved around very easily and stored very easily. We have a problem in medicine in the world at the moment. The United States, in inverted commas, the most sophisticated health system in the world, is spending about 18% of GDP in health against a declining life expectancy at birth. And so these considerations around cost need to be taken into account. The massive contributors to excessive costs of healthcare, the patients aging, patients' expectations, increasing availability of more care, etc., the advances in science that John mentioned earlier, and of course, the hospitals in the states are businesses, their salaries and supply costs. But research and regulation is also putting a burdensome cost into surgical research and not necessarily refining it. I always say it's a tale of two different disciplines, pharmaceutical and med tech. In the pharmaceutical in 2022, the top 10 drugs all earn more than about 15-20 billion per annum. If you look at the device companies in the world, the biggest device company in the world is Medtronic, which earns 29 billion per year from all its various things. Johnson & Johnson, 78 drugs give them 55% of their revenue. 18,000 device products give you 27% of revenue. So an expectation that the scientific introduction around the devices is the same as pharma is unrealistic, and we have to think of alternative ways, which is why I started looking at Ideal right from the beginning and embraced it as a concept. Clinical trial costs have just soared from 2 million per 1,000 patients in 1997 to about 30 million per 1,000 patients in 2024. And we think going up even higher than that. And, there are many inappropriate recommendations and failure to introduce different ways of assessment. And that comes around to things like prospective RCTs versus real world data, which needs careful consideration. And this is a recent article in The Guardian just pointing towards the fact that excessive costs may have ulterior motives, not necessarily about patient safety, but rather about vested interests in bodies that make money out of trials. The clinical research or contract research organizations, costs go up on a daily basis, and they're making money, and they have no incentive to streamline trials, make them more accessible, etc., because it is money that is being made out of research. And one of the CROs in Europe makes more money than one of the bigger device producers in Europe, and that's a bit weird. Regulatory pathways themselves are not perfect. FDA is a curious process. MDR, which the European Union have introduced, is a disaster. They don't know how to implement it, and they're having to delay it because it is just too burdensome and too expensive to do it, and it doesn't do what it is supposed to do. So what are the difficulties with tech innovation? We decided to follow the Ideal framework, and I wish I had more time to really counter some of the statements made from the colloquium, but perhaps we'll have to do that on a different occasion with more time. But we did follow the Ideal. We did the phase 0, was preclinical and animal. We did 350 cadavers. looking at every single operation. So by the time we came to humans, we knew exactly how it worked. We knew where the difficulties were. We knew what we could or couldn't do, and you knew what the reach was. Then we did a small first in human study, 30 cases, at the end of which we reviewed it with a team, and the review team is independent of me. There's about 8 of them in it. They come from Europe, America, all with very big names in research and in their specialties. And they review the videos of any problems. They go through the telemetry with me, and they assess whether the complications are related to the robot or not, whether they are expected for that operation, etc. And then we moved into a range of cohort studies, about 140 patients per cohort across a range of surgical specialties. And then for us, phase 3 was a registry of all comers. And we've had our registry running since the day the first patient went in. And as with all registries, you have difficulty getting people filling it in, but we've got about 14,000 cases on it and are analyzing it in a variety of ways. And of course, with the registry, you can analyze, we use QSIM analysis, which is not QSIM, we use control method analysis, and we end up with funnel plots, QSIMs, VLADs, etc. So we can measure learning curves. So when I tell you the learning curve for our robot for an experienced laparoscopic surgery is between 10 and 14 cases, that's because we've measured it and we've studied it across a cohort of people starting. And of course, it depends what your surrogate is, for matching the learning curve. Is it time? Is it complications? Is it conversion rates, etc.? We do analyze for all of them. And then once you're using it, of course, you can use your QSIMs and your funnel plots to make sure that those individuals are progressing safely along their path. We've also got a very sophisticated learning program, which is e-learning. Then we have simulation. We put the simulator on headsets because we found that in other simulators, people don't use them because they don't like sitting in a dark, cold theater late at night. So you can take the headset home and train. And we've also introduced proficiency-based progression into the training. So it's not time-based. Then the supervised practical training. We have dry runs, and then when people start, there's preceptoring and both telementoring to make sure that it's an absolutely safe introduction. Drug trials in medtech is way more expensive. The subjects, you lose less obviously than in a drug trial, but you have to give all sites a robot. You have to teach them how to use the robot. You need implementation teams to support the robot. You need maintenance of the robots. You add the instruments to the trial as free, etc., etc. And you need at least 20 cases before the surgeon can enter the trial because you have to have demonstrated that they've passed the learning curve. And then there are non-clinically relevant demands by the regulatory process. So it's an incredibly expensive process if you're going to enter into something like an RCT. Difficulty for industry, which I've seen, is some technology is unique. There is a reluctance to share data in the industry. They want their competitive edge and therefore wary of actually giving ideas to other companies. And there is a lack of comparative data, which hasn't helped. I've tried to interact with the other companies to see if we can find common ground and work with the societies to find where we can all agree a standardization. Obviously, our own machines get trained differently. And the peer review process fails a lot of this because people have a misunderstanding of the difficulties. Technological innovation, what constitutes the final finished form? Well, it's impossible. I change the software on our robot every 6 months. And I use a registry to evaluate that. So we date stamp every time the software changes, and then we do an analysis of the registry following on after that to make absolutely certain that there are no spikes in anything. And if you think about it, that's not uncommon. Vioxx was a drug that was a blockbuster, passed through the whole FDA. It was selling at 20 billion a year, and only because Kaiser Permanente had a registry did they pick up the association with cardiac events, which the company had known but had hidden from their RCTs. And so it's always interesting. The ISO standard is pretty strict. Evaluation needs to be multidisciplinary. I have engineers, physicists, clinicians, psychologists all working with me. The ISO 14791 is an agreement between 112 regulatory bodies and has been present since 2016. And we measure pretty much all the things that were mentioned in the paper that people felt should be introduced. So we do human factor studies, extensive human factor studies. We do risk perception. We try and understand foreseeable misuse. And then we hopefully with this bring. Now, one of the things that's made me realize is perhaps we should publish our work from ISO 14791, and so that people see the level that people go to in order to ensure safety. And I can tell you this is way more than many other surgical procedures that are introduced. Direct comparisons, this was just an interesting one where they said, you know, this was a paper showing that the hand controls of one of the robots was superior to ours. By the time the paper was published, we'd undergone 3 software upgrades. Hand controllers was one of them, and therefore the conclusion invalid. And I'm not quite sure how we're ever going to get around things like that. We'd also picked up the hand controllers weren't great from our ongoing human factor studies, and therefore had altered it. I think registries are very important. I don't think we use them properly. I don't think that they are necessarily curated just by us. Mine is obviously written by me. I partner with an independent academic group from Norway who runs the registry for me, and I have an independent committee that assesses the results and looks for any cheating. When you've got 50 or 100 or 200,000 cases in a registry, it is way impossible to actually corrupt that data or to cheat with it. And many of the missing data sets are sort of become unimportant when your data group gets to that size. And I'm not saying don't do RCTs, because we're just about to embark on some RCTs, but I think, as I said, RCTs did not pick up vaginal mesh as being a problem, and it was registries that actually would have identified them much earlier. So there's no easy answer. I personally like the ideal process. I think it's making the systems. I think, however, academia and industry need to collaborate a little bit more strongly. I think real-world data via registries can provide really good trial data and post-market follow-up. You cannot expect companies to give away competitive edge in some areas, and the academic community still needs to call out pure science, and there's a lot of that still going on in many other fields. So I'm sorry I've rushed, but time is short, and I'm sure you all need to get back to your work, and perhaps we could have a more detailed conversation about it at a later date. Thank you.